It's a real pleasure to be here on the West Coast and present some of the challenges of mindfulness. First, a question: how many of you have actually already implemented or been part of implementing mindfulness in the organization that you're working? Quite a few. How many of you found that it went through just without any challenges? 0. Okay. So I think you're very average in that sense, and what Jacqueline and I will be sharing over the next 20 minutes is some of the common challenges that organizations face. We will share 11 challenges that we see, and this is based on quite a lot of empiric studies in quite a lot of organizations. Before I go there, I'll just share how this all came about and how we got to know so much about the challenges. So I have a background in organizational research. I also have a background in mindfulness that I've practiced for about 25 years and been teaching for the last 15 years. And then I have a background in the corporate world with the Sony Corporation, where I worked for a number of years leading a group of people through a huge change process. Now, what I noticed was that the people around me, they were not really paying attention. They were distracted, like Richie told about those 47%. That was very apparent. And I thought in terms of productivity, but certainly in terms of well-being, they are losing out, totally losing out. So I thought, mindfulness might be a great help here. So I decided to quit my job and go into developing a mindfulness program. This is 10 years ago, so this was before people knew about the term mindfulness, really. And I got my first gig in an organization in Europe, and I was totally fired up because I was going to share everything that I had learned for about 10 years back then. I was really, really excited. So I came in there, I had the full day with this group, and the whole morning I put them to the practice, I explained all the stories from the Himalaya, and all those great things. I was fired up. There was a lunch break, I came back, standing there waiting, but they did not come back. And thank you for laughing, it was actually quite painful. However, what I learned was that if you want to take mindfulness, which is perceived as something very individual, very personal, sometimes very spiritual, and bring that into organizational context, you need to make a really, really, really seamless integration of mindfulness and work life. So I brought together researchers, mindfulness experts, and business leaders and spent 3 years developing a program that could then be taken into organizations. And there's been a lot of talk of the business rationale, and I think the movement that we're seeing right now is a very, very strong movement. Over the last 7 years, what we have seen, at least in our organization, and we know that Rich is seeing the same, that Mark, who will be on stage later, will share the same things, is that things are moving really, really, really fast in this space. So the challenges that we'll be sharing with you now is based on a lot of experience. We have done more than 5,000 workshops within organizations to about 50,000 attendees, 250 plus international companies, and those are in all industries from safety, construction, finance, consultancy, law, any kind of industry you can imagine. So we know also, the width of different challenges. 30 countries, 150 facilitators, always looking for new ones. So if you're interested, please come see us afterwards. 10 years of development developed by experts. That's really where we come from. And out of this, we have developed a lot of experience in how to do this. And that's what we really want to share with you now. So with those words, Jacqueline.
Thank you. So just before we get started, I just thought I'd share a little bit of my background to give you some context. So I was with Deloitte Consulting for many years here in the US, as well as in Canada and also in Australia. And I loved it. I mean, it was a very high-pressured, always-on, fast-paced environment. For me to be able to survive in that type of environment, it was very important that I had a mindfulness practice, because I knew that for me, it kept me focused, it kept me calm, it kept me resilient. But the thing is this was many years ago before mindfulness was very popular. So I kept it a secret because I didn't want anybody to think that I was weird or flaky or not take me seriously. Now, before I go on, can anybody relate to this? Is there any closet meditators out there? Any proud? I was proud, and it was for me. It just made sense. I mean, it was just like what you eat for breakfast. You don't need to share with your colleagues. This was just something that I did because I knew it was powerful for me. And I was very happy with that for many years. And then actually 6 years ago, something happened that really changed my way of looking at mindfulness. I was working as a program director for a multi-million-dollar program, system change, process change, layoffs. You guys probably know this. You live this many days of your lives. And what happened was my CEO who was a dear friend of mine, stood up in front of an audience of 200 people to announce some changes and passed out. Now, there were lots of tests, and everybody was like, oh, I wonder what's wrong. And nobody was saying what we all knew. He was under too much pressure. He was not taking care of himself. And specifically, he wasn't taking care of his mind. And I sat there, and I felt ashamed that I had had tools and techniques which were really quite simple, but I was too chicken to be able to share them with somebody that I really quite cared about. And so I decided to make it my mission to see if there was some way that I could bring mindfulness into the workplace. But I think for those of you who put up your hand to say you were a closet meditator, you probably know, it's just the idea of sitting still and combining that into fast-paced business life, just those two, at least in my experience, didn't equate. So in my journey, I actually had the fortune of, with my family, moving to Singapore, and I thought if I was going to come out of the closet, Singapore seemed like a great place to do it. And that's where I joined the Potential Project. And now, as you see, we've had the benefit and the privilege of introducing this to many organizations. Now, the journey has been a long one, and it gets easier and easier. And today, what we do want to share with you is even though it's been easier in the last 5 years as mindfulness has become more popular, it's still challenging for all of those of you who didn't put up your hand that you said any challenges. So as Rasmus said, and I'll just turn to the next slide, what we want to specifically look at is 4 challenges that we find can be particularly troubling for organizations as they start to make this journey. The first one is around misconceptions. The second one is in terms of the organizational context. The third one is in terms of facilitation. And the fourth one is in terms of context and content. Start off with misconceptions.
Misconceptions. There are a lot of misconceptions about mindfulness, and I'm sure many of you have come across some of these. The first one is that mindfulness is a woo-woo. And woo-woo can be many, many, many different things, but there are many ideas of what mindfulness is nowadays. So I really appreciated Rich thing with the dude from what's it called, The Big Lebowski. That's not what mindfulness is at all. So what we found is really, really useful if you want to come across with mindfulness is to wrap it in a scientific framework. As the other Richie Davidson this morning presented, there is massive, massive research on this. And it's not that we need to bring in science to convince them, but we bring in science as a way of, people trust in science. That is the religion of nowadays. So if you can share these things in a scientific framework, people stick to the practice because they can see, oh, this is good for me according to science, then they do it. So scientific framework, is our experience, is really, really important to overcome the woo-woo fear. Second challenge is that mindfulness is an individual thing. Now, of course, mindfulness is an individual thing. It is you sitting there, you're doing your practice, and that is very, very, very important. But when you bring this into an organization, it's not so important that it's an individual practice anymore. What we find is that we are working or living in this, what we call attention economy. And any organization is an attention economy where emails, where meetings, everything is screaming for people's attention. So how can we organize an organization in a way that attention is protected, that attention is leveraged, that attention is used in the most skillful way and not drowned in the massive distractions that is happening 24/7? So that mindfulness is not an individual practice, but it becomes an organizational transformation where it's a new way of working, because the way we're working right now really isn't working. The third thing in terms of misconceptions is that mindfulness is slow. It's about talking slow, walking slow as you go for your lunch, and that's just bogus. Had a great retreat with a great teacher 2 weeks ago. He basically said, mindfulness is about, mental speed. We are strengthening our mental speed, our capacity to deal with reality in a really skillful way with resilience. So mindfulness is really about boosting our mental capacity, not just so that we can do more and just go down that rabbit hole of being, more productive, but so we can see more clearly what is the right thing to do and what is just distractions. So those are 3 of the things that we have found misconceptions around mindfulness that is really important in any conversation in an organization to address these, because that will help to get some of the skeptics to turn around and be on your side. Next one.
So from an organizational perspective, one of the first challenges, one of the first questions that get asked is, what's the benefit of this? And from our perspective, it is very important to be able to link it to something that means something, not only to individuals, but also to the organization. So we do look and work closely with each organization to actually develop a business case that has meaning for them. Now, Rich did a great job today of showing some of the extremely compelling statistics that we know can actually link to business results and business drivers. And I think although it's very important, and this is something that Kelly and I have long conversations about, it's very important not to overpromise. But if an organization is going to invest in something, and this is an investment not only of money, but also of precious time, which is we know many things that we don't have enough of. So it is important to be able to understand what are the benefits. The second thing that we look at from an organizational perspective is that time factor. So even when we work with organizations that say, yeah, we really want to do this, there's all kinds of challenges. Well, we can't get people together. They don't have enough time. We're too busy. In fact, it's kind of funny. I mean, that's exactly why they need mindfulness, because they don't have enough time. So it's like, well, if you did a little bit of training, maybe it would help you open up a bit of space. But nevertheless, really working closely with organizations to be able to integrate it into their workday. One of the things that we have found works really well is, as opposed to trying to take people on long, extended periods of workshops, is actually looking at short, sharp, concise interventions. Give them a bit of training, let them actually experience it, and actually work with it, and then come back for more. And over a series of time, as opposed to a one-shot deal. Although we have many organizations that want to be able to be mindful in one day, we know that doesn't work. So this idea of time is really building it in and building an extensive program to make sure it's sustainable. The other thing that we find is, in terms of organization, it is the organizational acceptance. And back to what Rasmus was saying about this seeing as woo-woo, it is something that, I mean, even organizations that say, yeah, this sounds great, it's also like, yeah, I know I should eat better and I know I should exercise more. But how can we actually look at getting organizational acceptance? And what we know, especially when we are social beings, is to leverage the power of our social connections. And so for us, it really is important to engage champions and have people help each other out. Because if it's something we all agree that there's benefits and we're making time for, let's actually leverage that power that we have to be able to help each other do something that is actually good for us and good for the organization. The next thing, facilitators.
Facilitators. So that's us, or those of you who go into the organization and actually present this. And certainly when I started with my first gig, I was not a good facilitator for a few different reasons. We find that there are two challenges, main challenges here. First one is, what is happening a lot nowadays is facilitators with a lack of practice. So there is a lot of hype around mindfulness right now, and a lot of consultants and coaches think, oh, that's maybe a new revenue stream for me, great. They do a weekend course on mindfulness, and then they put them on a website and say, no, now I'm a mindfulness instructor. They go into organizations, they teach something, and we've talked to many, many organizations who come and say, you know, we tried mindfulness, didn't work for us. And you know, they've closed their door to that because people came in who really didn't have the depth of practice. So we find that it's very important that as providers in this space, but certainly as organizations looking for it, the first question to ask anyone who is interested in training with you is, what is your depth of practice? What retreats have you done? How long have you been practicing? Because without that, mindfulness is just a theory. And mindfulness is not a theory, it's a lived, it's a felt experience. And you can't teach it well if you haven't experienced that over an extended period of time. That is very important. But what is equally important is that the next challenge, that there's a lack of business understanding with facilitators. If that happens, organizations won't be able to identify, won't be able to align with that teacher. So it's just as important that anyone who goes into an organization has a business background, not necessarily from a corporate business, but just health, whatever, that they can talk the language of the people in the organization, that they can do with a certain speed, which is in the organization. If there's a very speedy organization and you go in and talk really slow, people are not going to listen because that's not their reality. You're doing a disservice. So having the combination of really strong practice with a strong business organizational understanding is crucial for this to be a success anywhere. And this is where I think there is right now a bottleneck in, let's call them the industry of mindfulness at work. We had a meeting this Monday with a very large 350,000 people organization that we're going to train. And I mean, how are we training that many people? Where do we find so many people? So again, a little plug. Any of you who's interested, please come and see us afterwards, because this is really, really important if we want to get mindfulness across as a really credible and effective tool in organizations. Last one.
Content. So what should actually be included in a mindfulness training? One of the things that we find is that mindfulness right now is popular. And a lot of times organizations will say, yeah, we want to get on that bandwagon. We want to just do mindfulness. But mindfulness for the sake of mindfulness may not necessarily engage employees. It may not necessarily get the sustainable change. It may not necessarily serve anyone. So when we look at it, we really are looking at mindfulness when you bring it into an organization, different than what you or I might do on our own personal time, but really wrapping it into what is the objectives for the organization. And maybe, as Richie talked about, maybe it is to enhance well-being, but be specific about that. What is it that we're trying to achieve with this program? And don't be shy about actually looking for measures and actually doing measures and outcomes to determine whether or not we see the needle changing in those key factors that we're looking in terms of our dashboard of what's important to us. And I think that is important because, again, this is the workplace. And from our perspective, we don't want to be shy about saying that mindfulness can be a skillful tool to enable business results. The second thing that we look at in terms of the actual content is that there's a perception that mindfulness is only a sitting practice, or that mindfulness is somehow yoga. Rasmus talked about the number of industries that we worked with, and some of them, well, construction was up there on the slide. As you can imagine, the idea of bringing mindfulness into a hard-nosed, hard-hat type environment, you can imagine what the jokes were before the introductory session. Some of them being, yeah, I can't wait to see the CEO in yoga pants. So this idea of what is the perception of mindfulness, and again, if mindfulness doesn't need to be something that's just about being slow, just about being something that's stillness, but something that is very intentional. The sitting practice basically being going to the mental gym to enable you, when you get up from the chair, to actually be able to do your work tasks in a way that is more effective, more productive, and perhaps even with some more kindness, with some more generosity, that can actually enable teamwork and all of those things that make an organizational life better and organizational performance better. So when we look at it, we really look at how do we apply this to work life. And one of the things that we often talk to organizations about is that, yes, we want you to sit for 10 minutes a day focusing on your breath, although that may sound challenging, and for many people, sitting still for 10 minutes is a really, really big deal. But what we say to them is, you know what, when you go and you're in a meeting and you notice your mind is wandering, because as Richie said, it wanders, it just naturally does. But if you recognize it and you choose to pay attention to the people and the topic and the task at hand, you're also enhancing that neural networking. You're also developing those attentional muscles. So in fact, you're adding to your training by specifically applying it to day-to-day work life. The final thing that we look at in terms of content is one of the things that's very important to us is mindfulness may not be the same for every organization. In fact, in our experience, mindfulness can be very different for every organization. As we said, if it's linked to business objectives, it may be an organization that is looking to enhance well-being. Another organization, it may be looking to enhance creativity. In the construction industry, it's actually specifically focused on safety, because we know that the number one reason why accidents happen is because people weren't paying attention. So for us, it's really important to look at what is the point and purpose of mindfulness in this organization, and then specifically customize it, not only because of their business objectives, but also in terms of their culture and their reality. And one of the things in terms of how far we want to go towards doing that is, you're all here because, well, you saw the title of the conference, it had mindfulness in it, and for some reason that meant something to you. But mindfulness may not mean something to other people. In fact, in some of the organizations that we work in, mindfulness can actually create a bit of tissue rejection. Just a little story about that. One of the clients that we worked with, again, in a very diverse environment, hard-nosed engineering environment, said, Jacqueline, I was really worried that you were going to come flying in on your unicorn talking about mindfulness and it would not be a good experience. So one of the things that we look at, if mindfulness isn't a good word, are there other words that we can use so that the words and the language that we use don't become a barrier to something that we know can potentially open people up in terms of enhancing well-being, enhancing focus, and all of those other things that Rich talked about earlier on. So those were just some highlights of some of the key things that we wanted to share with you in terms of our experience.